How you doing? My name is Glenn. I'm with V-Power Equipment. Today we're going to do a video that's basically on troubleshooting problems that you may run into when installing the tri-fuel carburetor. Now this isn't about the install. This is if you've got it all installed and everything seems to be right to you and you maybe can't get it to run on propane or natural gas, or maybe it's not coming all the way up to speed, it's running but not running correctly. So we're basically going to go over some of the things, basically how it works, and then we're going to go over some of the things that I have found most common that will cause this problem. And also then we'll go into some little tricks and stuff that I've learned along the way that sometimes can resolve some of these problems. So basically let's talk a little bit about the unit itself. So I'm sure you're all familiar with it because you should have it by now. But this is the tri-fuel carburetor. There's several different versions. This is one of them. And basically, this is the fuel control valve. Now, so you understand how this works, vacuum is everything to these things. When they're running on propane or natural gas, basically this unit here, it's not a regulator. A lot of people think it is, but it's not. It's basically a control valve. And as the vacuum comes up when the engine's trying to start, and especially after it starts, and it starts pulling the vacuum, it opens the diaphragm in this valve. This allows the fuel to flow in to the carburetor so that it can now start running on natural gas or propane. So vacuum is very important on these things, and a lot of times it is part of the problem. Generally, anytime you're having this condition, it's always because it's not getting enough fuel. The whole thing is, why is it not getting enough fuel? Is it not getting enough fuel because there's a problem with the vacuum, or is it not getting enough fuel because there's a problem with the fuel supply going to the unit? So we're going to try to figure out, help you figure out exactly what the problem here is. So let's start with the real basics things. When you install this on your generator, you have to do a complete install. You have to install the air box, install the filters, put the cover on the air box, everything. Because if you try to do this with the air filters out of the generator, that can actually cause a reduction in vacuum. That reduction, not always, but sometimes can be enough that it won't fire off on propane or natural gas. So that's the first thing. Make sure this thing is completely installed. Okay? Second of all, we have to look for any possible vacuum leaks. Now, the most common thing I run into is the gasket between this unit and the engine is on backwards. I know most of us think, no way I did that. Please check it. I've done it myself. I've run into many times that customers have done it. They slap it on, put the carburetor on, that's on backwards. It will not work with that gasket on backwards. So please double check that gasket between here and the engine. Make sure that gasket is fitting properly on the carburetor. I'm going to just kind of line it up here for you. You know, that gasket should be fitting like that. You may want to put that on the carburetor, hold it up to the engine, then go ahead and slide it on the engine. It's critical that that's on the right way. Most common cause that I find with a problem with these carburetors. Next thing you may want to do is, if you have gasoline in the generator, start it up on gasoline, because that will help us determine where the problem may lie. Because if it runs fine on gasoline but won't start on propane or natural gas, well, that indicates that we probably need to look more at the supply of fuel to the carburetor rather than the install. It doesn't totally mean the install is correct, but in most cases, if it runs on gasoline and it doesn't run on natural gas or propane, we want to kind of focus a little more at the supply, how the fuel is getting to the carburetor. There are some exceptions, and I will talk about them in just a little bit. So if you have gasoline, you want to try that. If it doesn't start on gasoline, that's two totally separate circuits. So if it won't run around on gasoline, it's not going to run around on propane. And then you want to totally focus on the install. There's something wrong with the install because they are two totally separate circuits. It should be able to run on both. So that's the next thing. Now that'll help you determine where to go next. So after that, what we want to look at, another very common cause that I run into on these things, is this part of the control valve on many engines will sit very, very close to the cylinder head. That is okay. It can be as close as it wants to be, but it can't touch it. So you may want to take, after it's installed, and just try to run a piece of paper or something between this and the cylinder head, because it can't touch the cylinder head. Because if it does, then when you bolt this thing down, it doesn't get a flat seal up against the plastic spacer block basically that's on the engine. And if it doesn't get that flat seal, that's a vacuum leak. That will definitely stop it. That's also the exception. Sometimes that vacuum leak can be so small that it will run on gasoline, but will not run on propane. So we're going to want to check that. Now, let me show you, I'm going to show you a way, if this does contact the cylinder head, you can rotate this valve and kind of move it out of the way. And I've got one apart here. I'm just going to show you. So basically, on the unit here, I've already taken this unit apart for the sake of the video. So what we can do is we can rotate this bowl. And since this is bolted to the bowl, you change its position. So what you want to do on the units that have this electrical solenoid, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take the solenoid off. Now there's a little O-ring on that solenoid. Make sure you don't lose it, because you need to have that when you put it back on. So you're going to take the solenoid off. You're going to loosen this automatically comes off when you take the solenoid off because it's the same bolts. You're going to loosen this big nut in the middle. Now you can rotate the bowl. You don't need to rotate it much because you do have a hose connected here, but you can rotate it just a little bit, and that will pivot this thing away from the cylinder head. So if it's touching the cylinder head, you're going to want to go through this process and get this thing so it is not touching the cylinder head, because again, that will make it so it's not fitting flat. So on the units without the control valve, you're basically just a big nut in the middle, and all you do is loosen that nut, and then the same process. You can just kind of rotate that bowl and move this thing away from the cylinder head. So that's one of the things you're going to want to start checking for. Now, another thing I want to mention here is just the characteristics of natural gas and propane. They will start hotter on natural gas or propane. So if it's electric start, you generally don't notice it that much because you ain't doing the work. But if it's a pull start, especially the very first try, it's probably going to take some pulls. You're going to want to prime it slightly. I don't want to use that one, it's up at the top. You're going to want to prime it slightly with that valve, which when you push this button, you should be able to hear fuel flowing. And you're going to want to prime it a little bit to get some of the air out of the lines. If you feel like you've primed it too much and you can start to smell gas, just walk away, shut the valve, let it kind of go away. The air is still out of the lines and the line should be good. So we just don't want to be starting it if this thing's full of gas, because we could cause damage. So basically, but it is going to start hotter. So if you're just doing a few pulls and you're going, well, it ain't running, well, it might take a few more pulls, especially the first time, because we've got to purge all the air out of the lines. We've got to purge all the air out of this valve before this thing is going to start to run on propane. Now, if you leave it connected basically to the tank, you have to shut the valve off, because you can't leave them sitting with the valve on with these things. But it's still, that line would most likely, not get filled with air. If you're using it commonly, you won't have that problem. If you let it sit for several months and then go to start it again, you'll have to do the process again, because you've got to get that air bled out, because the propane will eventually kind of just go away. So that's going to be one of the things. So if you're just having a hard time starting it, it may just take a little more effort on the first shot. Okay, next thing we're going to look at is we've got this little red valve here. It says LPG and natural gas. Clearly, you want to put that, if you're running on natural gas, you want to put it in natural gas, and obviously the other way. However, I definitely run into situations where some generators will run better when this is on natural gas when it's running off propane, or vice versa. It's basically just an offer size. The name of the game here is to get this generator to run right, and honestly, if this has to be set on the wrong thing, but the generator is running right, that's really all that matters, because we just want this generator to run at normal RPMs and run right. So you may want to try switching this to the other side and just see if that makes any difference. So if that doesn't help you, the next thing we're going to go to, I'm trying to think here, what is the next step? All right, so the next step we're going to do, and this probably comes more into the manual start, although I've definitely seen it work on both. Sometimes we just got to purge the air out of the system, especially on the initial startup. So on these cases here, we can do what we call switching it on the fly. Basically what you want to do is you want to have nothing plugged into the generator, because the generator will stumble during this process, most likely. Sometimes it won't, but most likely it will stumble during this process. So we don't want anything plugged into it. If there's anything plugged into it, you can burn out the ABR in the generator. So what you're basically doing is you're starting it on gasoline, and then you are, while it's running on gasoline, you are opening up your LP valve or your natural gas valve, and then you are turning off the gas valve. Basically what happens is as the engine starts to run out of fuel, it starts to pull the air, the gas through. So it helps to purge the gas out. Sometimes you even got to do it a couple of times till you get all the air out of it. But generally what will happen is all of a sudden it'll pull that, it'll get unairbound, it will start pulling the gas in, and then it'll like I said, it'll probably stumble, and then all of a sudden it will kind of take off and start running again, and now it's running on natural gas or LP. Once it comes back to normal RPMs, you're all set to go. You can go ahead and plug things into it, and it'll be fine. So that's basically switching the thing on the fly. So these are the most common things that we find. As I said, it's always, well, I shouldn't never say always, but 99% of the time, it's fuel. So this is covering what would happen maybe during the install or airbound or whatnot that can cause a fuel problem. The next problem comes into the actual fuel supply. We've got fuel being fed into this thing. Now, if you're doing LP and you're doing the smaller tanks, and you bought our regulator and our hose, you should be good to go. Now remember, the tanks always have to be vertical, valve on top. You can't lay the tanks down because that's a liquid way of feeding propane, and that won't work with these. So the tank has to be vertical. And like I said, if you have our valve and our hose, you should be good, because that regulator is designed to run with these carburetors. Now, if you go to Home Depot or something and buy a regulator for a gas grill and hook that up to it, it's probably not going to work. Them regulators just don't have the ability to allow that much flow. These generators can draw some pretty serious fuel, and that regulator will not do it. Some of them actually have a trip device in them that will literally trip and shut down. So you can't use an off-the-shelf regulator. You can use a commercial grade regulator if you go to a supply house and tell them what you're doing. Like if you have bigger tanks, maybe you have 100-pound tanks, you can buy a regular commercial grade regulator, and that will work fine because it's designed to allow that kind of flow. But gas grill regulators will not work. So the other important thing is, you'll notice if you bought the LP regulator with us, it comes with a piece of hose. That hose is about 3 feet long. That's about as far as you can go. We only got a 3/8 barb here. So that's okay, because a carburetor, these systems here, they're literally pulling the fuel in because of that vacuum, so they're actually drawing it in. So they can pull it through a 3/8 hose for about 3 feet, not much longer. If you put a 6-7 foot hose on there, you're probably going to have an issue with it. So that would be the LP side. If you're using our regulator, our hose should not be an issue. Again, if you want, you can push this button, should be able to hear fuel flow. That's a good indication that that's all right. So it gets I shouldn't say a little, it gets a lot more tricky when you're talking about natural gas. First of all, I can't recommend to you how you should pipe your natural gas. That's regulated by code. It's regulated by your town or your gas authority, depending on where you are. And I am not a licensed plumber, and I cannot recommend how you should hook this to natural gas. I can tell you, however, that you need to have adequate pipe size. And even though this is 3/8, if you're running that pipe any distance, you're going to need a lot bigger than 3/8. Generally 3/4 is a minimum. So you need to make sure that there's enough fuel. And then when you get close to the carburetor itself, excuse me, when you get close to the carburetor itself, you can tape down to the 3/8 for as short as a distance you can, because you're basically just trying to put a little whip in there. Try to get it down to a foot if you can, or even less. You want that 3/8 to be as short a distance as you can, and make sure that you have adequate natural gas supply side to the generator. Again, you would need to contact, if you're not really well versed in this, you would need to contact a local plumber or your gas company, somebody that is well versed. Make sure you tell them what you're doing and running the generator, so they realize that it needs that kind of flow, and then they should be able to help you on the natural gas side. So basically, I think that covers most of the issues, and generally, once you go through these processes, you will find what's causing the problem, and you should be fine, because these things work real well. problems with them are almost, once you get past, you know, if you do have a problem during the install, I mean, most people don't even have a problem after the install, but if you do have it, checking these things will generally straighten it all out for you, and you should be good to go. So I hope that video helps you out, and we thank you for watching. Have a good day.